Ukraine does seem to be making slow but steady advances, pushing Russian forces back yard by yard, village by village, trench by trench. Good news. But behind that, there is the possibility looming this week the Russians could allow Europe's biggest nuclear power station, Zaporizhzhia, to blow up. Perhaps to create a radioactive barrier to further Ukrainian advances, perhaps out of mere devilment. President Zelensky has been warning about this since the winter, but Ukrainian warnings are now getting louder. In the past couple of days, the head of military intelligence, Major General Budanov, announced that the Russians have planted explosives next to 4 of the 6 reactors, and they've mined the cooling pond, which supplies the water essential for chilling the nuclear reactors. On Friday, Ukrainian military intelligence warned that the 3 Russian supervisors there had evacuated, and Ukrainian employees had been told to get out by July the 5th. That's Wednesday. The report also said that personnel remaining behind had been told to blame Ukraine in the case of any emergencies. Now, it's important not to be alarmist, but at the same time, this is potentially such a huge threat that it is also worth trying to find out what might be going on and what the consequences would be. As it happens, NATO is holding its annual summit in Vilnius, Lithuania, next week. President Biden will be there, and Ukraine will be right at the top of the agenda, along with higher military spending and new arrangements to move troops east if necessary. Now, before we came on air, I spoke to Admiral Rob Bauer. He's the Dutch serviceman who chairs NATO's military committee, and I began by asking him about that NATO conference and what they'll be discussing.
There's a number of topics. One will be on Ukraine, and that is on the rightful place in Europe of Ukraine, and of course the discussion on NATO membership. And in 2008, the nations agreed to that membership, but there was not a discussion on the how and when. I think there will be more discussions on the how and when, but it will also include a multi-year package of assistance to Ukraine. There is a discussion ongoing on changing the NATO-Ukraine Council to or committee to the NATO-Ukraine Council, which means that is a group not just talking with one another, but there can actually be decisions. That's the difference between a committee and a council.
Admiral, through most of my lifetime, this idea that NATO members had to provide at least 2% of their GDP for defence has been something everybody talked about. Almost no countries actually did. It was almost a joke. Are we at the end of that period? Is the 2% now going to be something that all NATO members actually commit to?
Well, of course, the decisions by the heads of state and government will be in Vilnius, and there's still talk on the exact wordings of that agreement, the defense investment pledge. But I think we have to understand that we've come from far. I mean, in 2014, in the Wales summit, the nations agreed to a phrase that was going towards 2%, 20% of their budget to investments, and no lower budgets in absolute terms. And I think in general that has happened. Some nations faster than others. And we are approaching in 2024 the point where quite a large number of nations actually reach the 2% level. So if the nations now agree to 2% as a floor, that is a considerable change to what we have agreed so far, because moving towards is not the same as moving to actually 2%. So I think there is a change. The nations understand that the situation in the world and the war in Ukraine was a great game changer in that sense, forces us to look at defense in terms of collective defense again. And that is also one of the deliverables for Vilnius. We will look at the deterrence and defense, the regional plans. That is basically what do you have to do to truly deter and defend the two threats, Russia and the terror groups.
Let me ask you, if I may, about the progress of the war in Ukraine itself. We are seeing lots and lots of reports of quite small but steady advances by the Ukrainian army. What's your assessment of the success so far of the counteroffensive?
Anyone who would tell you that it would be easy doesn't understand warfare. I think we have to realize this is extremely difficult. This is the Russians that dug themselves in 3 defensive lines. There's huge minefields. There's huge obstacles for tanks and for other vehicles, and that is in 3 layers. Sometimes it is a couple of kilometers. Sometimes it's even 30 kilometers deep. This area. So to get through a minefield first, then to get over an obstacle, and then over another obstacle with a considerable amount of Russian troops on the other side is never going to be easy. So that is one. Warfare is something that is very unpredictable, because it is done by 2 nations with people that think, that will react on what the other does. So this is never a static thing. So whenever the Ukrainians take initiative, the Russians will respond to it. So every day, the 2 nations will have to see what the result is and how far they have come. And it is difficult. Yeah. It is scary. People die as a result of this. So I think it is important people do not understand it's a magical switch.
It's really, really hard. It's been compared by some people to the D-Day landings in the Second World War. But of course, the difference at D-Day was that the Allied forces had overwhelming air superiority and air support, and the Ukrainians don't. Do you think there is any realistic chance in the short term that they are going to be given the fighters they need?
Well, the discussion on the fighters is an important one, but it will not be solved in the short term for this counteroffensive, because training those pilots, training the technicians, making sure there is a logistic organization that can actually sustain these aircraft will not be available before the end of this counteroffensive. So we shouldn't mix the 2 discussions. I think it is important. It is understandable that Ukraine asks for these fighter aircraft, but we should not start to mix it with the counteroffensive discussion now.
All right. The hard question, do you think Ukraine can win without the fighter aircraft?
I think Ukraine is in an advantage because it has the Western weapon systems, it has the better training, and it has, very importantly, the much higher morale and motivation. We knew from history, basically, that is an extremely important part of the military operations. We see it again here in Ukraine. People are fighting for it's an existential fight. The Ukrainians understand what they are fighting for. The Russians don't have a clue what they're fighting for. So that makes a difference. And at the same time, it is difficult, as I said before. It is not an easy job to get through those barriers. I think they can. I think they can be successful, absolutely. But it is it will take time. And when they move forward and when they gain more terrain, they will have to take along air defense systems and to then protect what they have just gained. So again, it is possible, but it will not be easy.
And let me ask about the huge unknown in the middle of all of this, because Ukraine's military intelligence have said the Russians have mined the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, Europe's largest nuclear power station, both the water cooling system and some of the reactors themselves. And they have told workers to be out of there by Wednesday. Now, it is possible that this is just saber rattling and an attempt to scare people. But if the Russians detonated that nuclear power station, it would have a huge effect right across Europe. Can I just read to you what the advisor to President Zelensky's officer said? He said, a single public declaration by world leaders could preserve us from a terrorist attack on Europe's largest nuclear power plant. Can I ask you whether at Vilnius or before you think NATO can make a really strong, firm public statement against the possibility of such attack and thereby prevent it?
Andrew, that is a very political question. I'm not in charge of that part of the Vilnius summit. I'm convinced people are talking about it. I don't know whether it will be part of the statement, so I won't speculate on that. If this would happen, then it is a much bigger problem than just a military problem or something only for NATO. This is something that the world will be involved in. This will have an enormous impact in Europe. It is an environmental disaster. It is a medical problem. It is so. This is beyond just NATO, so to say. This is beyond just a security issue, and therefore one would hope that the Russians will not do this, because I think it would take away a lot of the support they have in the world if they would do this. I cannot imagine that a number of nations that actually support them would support this act by the Russian government.
It makes no sense, clearly, but at the same time, you know, the war is full of illogical actions, and this could be one of them.
Yeah, we are keeping track of this, and we are watching it very, very closely, together with the International Atomic Energy Agency. So there's a lot of people that have a stake in this and are watching this.
Well, listening to Admiral Rob Bauer from NATO is